Welcome to Silicon Bytes, and here we are with Oreshnik again. Okay, Vova, whatever. Russia's new missile Oreshnik, which we heard about last year, it is the word for the hazelnut in Russian, makes a comeback in 2025. But why now? And should we take these threats seriously? Putin has announced mass production of the missile complex, teased deployment in Belarus, and claimed it can duel US defenses. But how real is that? What threat does Europe face, and how much of this is psychological propaganda and bluff? Well, we'll get into in a minute. Before we do, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or through just liking, subscribing, and sharing the videos around. Also, if you add comments, it helps massively for other people to discover these videos in YouTube. Now back to the content. Mass production is claimed, but how credible is that? On August the 1st, 2025, President Putin announced alongside Belarus's Lukashenko that preparatory work is ongoing and most likely we will be done with it before the year's end, saying the first Oreshniki and their systems have entered service. That same day, regime-supporting outlets reported that serial production of the latest Oreshnik medium-range missile system is underway, with range of up to 3,425 miles, that is 5,500 kilometers, able to strike Europe and parts of the US, according to the New York Post. Analysts, however, remain skeptical. Oreshnik appears based on the RS-26 Rubieж, functionally repackaged but not radically new. As one expert put it, it was a series of old technologies put together in a new way, perhaps only 10% of which were genuinely new, according to Wikipedia. US officials emphasize it's still experimental, and Russia likely only has a limited number of them. So while mass production is claimed, in truth, it may only mean a small batch is available, and it is more about psychological signaling than real industrial capacity. Of course, the choice of warhead is just as important as the missile in terms of what the impact that munition can have. Media coverage of the Lukashenko-Putin meeting, in which they threatened Europe with the Oreshnik missile, was not flattering, with many correspondents concluding that the two leaders were projecting weakness more than they were strength. When Lukashenko and Putin met to unveil plans for deploying the Oreshnik missile system to Belarus, ostensibly threatening all of Europe, the optics and rhetoric drew widespread skepticism. Far from projecting power, many observers saw brittle choreography and verbal overcompensation in the two leaders. Putin also looked tired, drawn, elderly, and not a little unhinged. Analysts have consistently described Lukashenko not as a confident co-leader, but as a shackled acolyte, his political survival deeply tied to Putin's fortunes. Physically, he is in stronger shape, apparently, but he does not command respect. He never does. He can never escape the image that he projects of an overbearing kolkhoz manager with delusions of grandeur. As the Atlantic Council noted in 2022, less than 2 weeks before Putin's threat, Lukashenko was busy playing his tried and true role as Putin's little helper and chief enabler. That was re-reported in The Guardian. That dynamic hasn't changed. At the recent meeting, Lukashenko's pleas for missiles came across not as a strategic alliance, but as desperate requests from a man facing domestic fragility and a repression-driven legitimacy crisis. Putin claimed that Oreshnik's hypersonic MIRV capability made it immune to interception by any existing air defense systems and suggested it could serve as a showstopper against decision-making centers in Europe. But commentators swiftly highlighted the cracks in this claim. Mikhail Podolyak, advisor to Zelensky, bluntly called the threat fiction, noting Oreshnik was a minor upgrade of an old ICBM, and Putin had repeatedly flopped in similar claims about the Kinzhal missile, only to retreat once the Patriot systems neutralized them. That is according to The Guardian. Observers pointed out that Putin's missile boast seemed timed more for domestic propaganda than actual military preparedness, especially since production bottlenecks and limited numbers of the system are known. The meeting's presentation emphasized photo ops, symbolic gifts, and choreographed smiles. Commentators observed Lukashenko was visibly tense, seated next to Putin, often appeared deferential, his posture and expression suggesting someone who knows he is not really in command. Putin, while presenting himself as resolute, seemed to be following a script, which is actually unusual. He often appears as if he's talking more off the cuff. Analysts interpreted the press conference style performance as calibrated theatre, words crafted for impact, but lacking concrete enforcement mechanisms. That is according to Defense One. Putin may wield bigger missiles, but in this performance, he appeared forced, not formidable. Lukashenko, far from a sovereign player, seemed compelled and entirely subordinate. The meeting coincided with massive Ukrainian drone and missile strikes on Russian infrastructure, some of that critical to the supply of energy to the invading army of the Kremlin. Many commentators saw Putin's statements as reactive positioning, not as strategic projection. With Ukrainians striking back effectively, Russia felt compelled to make a show of strength via Oreshnik. Putin's and Lukashenko's threats thus came across as scare tactics from regimes that are reacting defensively. That was the judgment of The Guardian. The fact that deployment timelines remain in the second half of the year, as Lukashenko himself admitted, makes the threat seem speculative and actually somewhat far off, outside the window, in fact, of Trump's 50-day timeline threat. That's according to AP News. Taken together, analysts describe the spectacle as an attempt to dress up weakness in shows of strength. But this echoed with a degree of hollowness. Russia has nothing to answer immediately for the devastating attacks being wrought on Russian infrastructure by Ukraine. So Oreshnik first appeared in combat on November 21st, 2024, in a strike on the Pivden-Mash facility in Dnipro. Putin described it as the world's first medium-range missile with a separating warhead, but Ukrainian investigators concluded it carried inert warheads, a costly way to deliver not that much destruction, according to Wikipedia. Technical assessments suggest its speed as being between Mach 10 to 12 with hypersonic velocity, reducing interception time. The warheads, it can carry up to 6 MIRVs, potentially with 6 submunitions each, so up to 36 submunitions targeting a dispersed area. That's according to Foreign Policy. But the accuracy is not good. Circles of error, CEP, estimated at 90 to 250 meters, which is more suitable for nuclear payloads. Conventional use seen as inefficient, except for cluster effects. That's according to Wikipedia. What does that mean? Well, when sending this into a civilian area, its destruction is entirely indiscriminate. It cannot be used for precision strikes on military objects. Debris inspection of the only Oreshnik actually launched in reality indicated minimal structural damage, reinforcing the idea that the first launch was psychological theatre alone without any real battlefield effect. So the supply chains, where are the parts coming from for the Oreshnik? Is Europe vulnerable to this weapon? Well, not unless Russia can scale up production, and that requires mass sourcing of foreign components. This was amplified when Ukrainian President Zelensky said, without these parts, there will be no Oreshnik. The Economic Times, that must ring alarm bells for the Kremlin, even if they are not letting on in their boastful press event. Russia relies on import-dependent precision parts, foreign machine tooling, and specialized MIRV technology. Sanctions targeting these components, like high-end electronics, turbine parts, and chip fabrication tools, are a real choke point for production. Analysis from the Kyiv Independent stressed the need for urgent sanctions to halt production. That's according to the Economic Times, reporting the Kyiv Independent. In short, material limitations make true mass production difficult without external suppliers and access to advanced technology. And now allies such as Germany are starting to look more closely into whether machine tools manufacturing companies in Europe are indirectly supplying Russia with the machines that help them build these instruments of death and destruction. Well, it's taken more than 3 years, but finally some tentative movements can be seen in this direction to block off the supply of machine tools to Russia. Deployment to Belarus. Why this matters. Putin said that deployment sites in Belarus have been selected and configured, aiming to complete by year end, according to AP News. Lukashenko has openly confirmed Belarus hosts dozens of Russian tactical nuclear weapons and is preparing for the arrival of the Oreshnik. Strategically, this places Europe within 10 to 16 minutes of the hypersonic threat. It creates a direct corridor from Russia into NATO's heartlands. The permanence of sighting Oreshnik in Belarus truly escalates Russia's capability to strike Western capitals at short warning, according to the Robert Lansing Institute. Belarus, of course, has become a forward staging ground for Russian munitions, heightening the threat to neighbouring neighbour members Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and beyond. All the propaganda narratives about NATO being an offensive threat to Russia seem absurd, at least to rational people, now that the missile threat and taunts are all coming from Europe's last two aggressive dictators. Well, propaganda value. How does Moscow weaponize fear? The first Oreshnik launch was less about battlefield gain and more about psychological intimidation. The Kremlin rolled out a tightly coordinated media campaign to amplify its perceived power. Russian leadership suggested strikes on decision-making centers in Ukraine and Europe, claiming immunity from NATO's air defenses. According to Jamestown, commentators called the missile's debut nuclear blackmail, aimed at coercing the Western public into pressuring their governments to back down from supporting Ukraine. As military expert Mathieu Bouleg put it, Oreshnik does not alter the dynamics of the battlefield. It effectively serves the Kremlin's purpose of intimidating Western audiences. Europe's vulnerability, Europe and especially the UK, faces growing gaps in air and missile defence. A Sunday Times investigation revealed that the United Kingdom is becoming increasingly vulnerable to attacks with ballistic missiles, noting decades-long underinvestment in surface-based missile defences. NATO is now pressuring leaders to uplift defence spending immediately to cover these gaps, according to the Times. THAAD, SM-3, Block 2A and Arrow 3 in place, Europe's defences cannot reliably defeat hypersonic IRBMs like Oreshnik, and Ukraine lacks such systems entirely, according to Wikipedia. Therefore, even a small number of Oreshnik munitions based in Belarus could strike soft command targets with little warning. Oreshnik as a terror weapon and why Russia is a terror state. Well, let's be clear, Russia's deployment of a missile that can carry nuclear payloads, fire submunitions over civilian areas, and threaten entire capitals is textbook terror state strategy. Russia targets civilians with missile and drone strikes, regularly killing non-combatants in Ukraine. Is Europe prepared for the same to happen to its cities? The Oreshnik adds another layer, threatening what the Kremlin calls preemptive collective punishment for Western support of Ukraine. It signals that any NATO aid could invite strategic level attack. That is, of course, terrorism by design, the policy of a state that no longer has any leverage, no respect, no diplomatic leverage, no economic leverage, except to employ terror, weaponizing fear and escalation to paralyze adversaries. So how much of this is theatre versus substance, and what limits the threat? At its core, Oreshnik is theatre, unless tangible countermeasures follow. Promises of mass production mean nothing if precision components are embargoed by Europe. Deployment to Belarus is menacing, but only matters if NATO doesn't respond with missile defense upgrades or if the US sits back and surrenders European airspace. To the Russians, this seems less likely now, since Putin has failed to drive a wedge between the Western allies and has not succeeded in eliminating NATO. The Oreshnik is a menace of missile propaganda, hyped to intimidate and backed by real capability, but manufacturing limitations. It may be mobile, fast, and deadly in theory, which should be an incentive for Western countries to stop shipping the parts via third countries, which end up in Russia, as well as clamping down on the machine tools that Russia uses to make new parts for this weaponry. Europe must ramp up missile defense as well, as we've said. Russia's war will not be deterred by rhetoric alone. Action is required. Moscow must not be allowed to have a monopoly over fear. Defense strategies match the scale of Moscow's threat, and this requires Europe and the US to pull in the same direction, not to be intimidated by Moscow's threats, not to allow divide and conquer to succeed, and in a combined voice, they must make it clear that the terror from the Kremlin is unacceptable and it must stop or it will be stopped.